welcome back to JavaScript Playground. In this video, we will talk about AJAX. AJAX is a short form for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It allows web pages to be updated asynchronously by exchanging data with the backend. This makes it possible to update parts of a web page without reloading the entire page. Initially, AJAX was used to send and receive XML because that was how the data was received from backend in old days. But now it can also be used to send and receive JSON objects, which is pretty common these days. Now, if you remember, I just mentioned a word asynchronously. Normally, the way JavaScript code is run is that it executes one line of code and then moves to the next line and then the next line and so on. Say there's a line of code which takes 5 seconds to execute. This would just mean that JavaScript will have to wait 5 seconds before it can move on to execute more lines of code. Now this is a bad user experience because your web page will just freeze for 5 seconds and your user will not be able to do anything on the web page. To avoid this, there is another way to execute a specific part of code such that the execution starts and it runs in the background, which allows the rest of the code to be executed. And once the 5-second task is complete, it lets JavaScript know that it is completed and a function can be called. Now, you must be wondering what line of code might take 5 seconds to execute. When you send a request to the backend, it takes time to bring back the response. And for some requests, it might even take up to 5 seconds or even more. That's why it is recommended to make backend requests as asynchronous. AJAX uses a browser built-in XML HTTP request object to make requests to the backend server. This gave a simple and standard way to make HTTP requests from JavaScript to get content and update the HTML page. Let's give it a try. Say we wanted to get a list of to-do items from the backend. So there is a site JSON placeholder. So it gives you access to some dummy APIs. So scrolling down here, so it has the /todos, and when you try this URL, it gives you a list of to-do items, and this is in JSON array, so we've got some objects inside an array. So coming to my JavaScript code, let's create a function. Let's say get to-do list from backend. To use the XML HTTP request object, first we need to create a new instance. If you remember from the previous videos, to create a new instance, we use the new keyword. So var, let's say HTTP. So XML HTTP request and parenthesis, and this will follow new. So this line of code will create a new instance of this XML HTTP request object and will store it inside this HTTP variable. To define the URL endpoint and the type of request, this HTTP XML request object gives us access to a method called open. So we can simply do http.open. Now it accepts 3 parameters. First is the type of request. So in our case, it's get because we're trying to get some data from the backend. Second is the API endpoint or the URL. So we just copied this URL so that we get this list. And the third argument accepts a Boolean value to define whether the call is synchronous or asynchronous. It is recommended to make it asynchronous, so I'm just going to give it a value true. Now to trigger this call, we can use another method called send. So http.send. And now when I call this function, it will create a new instance of this XML HTTP request object. It will send a get request to this URL and it will execute this request as an asynchronous code so that it runs in the background. So let's give it a try. So when I save it, so if you see here, nothing changes because we aren't handling the response, we've just sent the call. So to check it, we can go to this network tab. And now if I refresh my page, and I can filter here. So it was JSON something. So as you can see, it's showing the request method is get. Status code is 200. The request URL is JSON placeholder.typecodecom/todos. And when I do preview, it gives me a list of these objects. So that means our call was executed and we got the response. To access that response, we need to handle it. So in the next video, we will learn how to handle the response. And that's all for